I am Tamar Ishalom, and this is Jewish Crossroads. We're living through one of those moments where the headlines don't quite capture the full picture. There is a ceasefire in place between Israel and Iran, but it doesn't feel like anything is really over. There's tension in the air, questions about what comes next, and a sense that the deeper story about Iran, its regime, and the region is still unfolding. That's exactly why I wanted to talk with Roya Hakakian. She's a Jewish Iranian-American writer, journalist, and poet who's been telling the story of Iran for decades. She's lived through revolution and exile and brings that layered perspective to everything she writes and talks about. Yes, certainly Roya analyzes the politics, but much more important, she helps us understand the people living through them and what it means to hold onto identity, memory, and truth across borders. So if you're trying to understand what's really going on beneath the surface, not just in the headlines, but in the soul of a society, there's no one better to talk to. Roya, I'm so happy to have you with us today.
Hi, Tamar.
Let's start with the moment we're in. President Trump announced a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. As we record this conversation, we're in the early days of that ceasefire. What's your reading of this delicate and, let's be honest, unclear moment?
I'm depressed. I mean, I'm not using the term facetiously. I really, really feel that so much resource, human resource, financial resource, were spent, and we didn't get to a place that we could have. And I mean, when I say we, I mean, you know, a better place for Iran and Iranians, a better place for Israel and Israelis, and a better place for America's influence in the world. I somehow don't see the last 12 days, what occurred, as any real achievement. I mostly see it as an opportunity squandered.
Why is that? Because the regime is still in power?
Well, the regime isn't just in power, the regime is declaring victory. The regime is also pulling out of, or at least is threatening to pull out of NPT, IAEA, and it's been arresting every opposition member of any note everywhere throughout the country. So as far as they're concerned, the fact that they have survived is a divine omen, is a divine sign that God wanted them to live. And when you kind of think about, you know, the metaphoric meaning of this, Nasrallah was killed, Assad fell, Sinwar and all those characters are gone, but, you know, Supreme Leader Khamenei is standing. So in that mentality, within that culture, the only thing that that means is that God wanted him to survive. And so I think, as far as I'm concerned, that's just one of the worst things that could have happened. And then on the other hand, you know, it looks like, apparently, according to a leaked document, that we only set Iran back, the United States set Iran back by only a few months. So there was no achievement from a nuclear perspective. And the regime is in place and they'll go back to doing what they've been doing. So unless I'm missing something, I want to know why this seems important to other people.
So the way you understand the reality in Iran now, it's not that we're not closer today to the fall of the regime than we were 3 weeks ago. We're further away.
I think we haven't moved. And I think in some ways, yes, we are further away, because you have to look at it from the perspective of the public that lives in Iran. So they've been coming out on the streets for many years. You know, they've done it in every possible way. You know, in one instance in 2017, 1,500 people were mowed down by the Revolutionary Guards throughout Iran over a weekend. So it isn't that the people didn't come out on the streets. This really frustrates me because a lot of people say, oh, the Iranian people are afraid to come out onto the streets. They have been coming out, and they have been met by brutal force. In 2009, they came out in the millions to demand a recount of the vote after the presidential election. In 2022, the country was shut down for several weeks. Over 500 people were killed and some hanged, and 20,000 were arrested. So it isn't that the people aren't doing anything. So when you look at it from their perspective, they say, we came out, we sacrificed our youth, we sacrificed a lot of people, and we didn't succeed. Israel came. They threw bombs on them for 12 days, and they didn't fall. So if you lived in Iran right now, would you say that there is hope to overthrow a regime that didn't fall after the Americans and the Israelis bombed the hell out of them? I don't know. I could be wrong, but that's sort of how I see it.
What could have been done different?
Look, people accuse me of advocating for regime change. It's the last thing in the world that I'm advocating. I am actually being really economically, in my own view, astute about this. I'm saying we spent the money. Israel used global credibility, international credibility to bomb, right? We brought a great deal of suffering to the Iranian people. We brought a great deal of suffering to the Israelis. And the one thing that should have happened was for the regime to be decapitated. So among all the people who were being assassinated, the supreme leader had to be included. And that could have given everybody a chance to try to turn the page. But as long as he stays in power, there is no reconciliation, there is no peace, there is no, stopping to death to Israel, death to America. So if there was going to be any real change, and I'm saying that, everything else would have stayed the same, that, the Revolutionary Guard Corps is still the Revolutionary Guard Corps, so much else could have stayed in place. But he had to go in order for even people within the regime to be able to say, unfortunately, he's gone. Now it's time for us to
change.
Turn the page.
So that could have been the game changer. And what you're saying is that don't enter the game if you know from the beginning that he's not part of the ones that are going to be assassinated.
Well, I'm saying this, we're all kind of, looking at the pieces and trying to complete the puzzle, who knows. I'm also thinking about what the loss of Nasrallah did. The loss of Nasrallah dealt a huge blow to Hezbollah, to his supporters. It is now allowing Lebanon to have hope. Maybe Lebanon will continue to stay as miserable as it has been. But if Lebanon has had any sense of hope, it's ever since Nasrallah has been killed and Hezbollah has been degraded. The same happened as a result of the degrading of Hezbollah and the killing of Nasrallah in Syria. Assad would have probably stayed in power had Hezbollah been there to support him, to keep him standing. So even if, have to guess anything based on the evidence of the last year, it looks like if there were to be a real change in Iran, that kingpin had to be removed from the equation, and he's still standing.
That there's a lot of speculation about what comes next, whether the ceasefire will open space for diplomacy or whether it's just a strategic timeout before further escalation. What should we be paying attention to in the days and weeks ahead? I mean, what would you hope political leaders, analysts, or listeners of Jewish Crossroads podcast don't miss in this moment?
Well, one of the things that really shocks me, and I find it, profoundly offensive, both as a Jew and as an Iranian, a person of Iranian descent, is hearing Israeli leadership give messages to the Iranians. Oh, people of Iran, we hope you, get out and overthrow the regime. That is not That is not who Jews are. That is not what Israel should be doing. That is not the message that anybody should be sending. They know what they have to do, and they don't need the Israelis to lecture them. But most importantly, it feeds into this cycle of Israel being, colonialist, arrogant regime, because Israel is a tiny country with a tiny population. It has no business telling, other nations how to run their business. All Israel can do is be Israel, meaning, make sure that, its enemies don't dare attack it and cause harm to it, and make sure that it thrives, because the thriving is what really puts imaginations on fire everywhere. Because people know the story. People can say, oh, tiny country, these people, scrappy, resettled the place, and look what they've done. The greatest Israel can possibly do is to just lead by example. But, the fact that, I don't know, the defense minister and this one and Netanyahu show up on world cameras and start dictating what Iranians should do is not only absurd, but also profoundly wrong. And it just feeds into the narrative of Israel being a bully.
And when that is accompanied by things said by Trump himself about the option of a regime change, you're saying you're not only not helping the opposition, you're doing the contrary.
Well, you have to, I really, perhaps it's because I'm a writer, but I really believe in the power of narratives, right? That the fact that, yes, we are at war, and it is a physical war, but it's also a war of narratives. So you have to pay attention to the narrative that the regime has built. The narrative that the regime has built is that they are victimized, let alone that, it's a giant country with nearly 90 million, and it's an ancient civilization. So how could it possibly be a victim? But, that's what they have sold to their own people. And they have sold to their own people the idea that Israel and the United States want to meddle with their affairs. And that's why they can't succeed. That's why they have to keep fighting back, because they want to strip them of sovereignty and all the rest. So let's deprive them of their narrative. And depriving them of their narrative means that if you have to go in to attack their missile production facilities or take down their nuclear program, everybody understands that. People won't like it, but they will understand. But once you begin to say that, oh, people of Iran, pour to the streets and overthrow your regime, it means that you have no clue what's going on in Iran. You have no sympathy for what Iranians have done so far and have not succeeded. And finally, you are, in fact, the very regional bully and, colonialist power that wants to dictate its own wishes upon the people. And that's the narrative, and we have to avoid falling into that narrative. I think one of the most beautiful things that I have encountered is that, in the last 20 years, whenever you look at polling that has been done in Iran on the issue of anti-Semitism and throughout North Africa and the rest of the Middle East, and much of it has been done by Anti-Defamation League, Iran always comes at the very bottom of the country within the region that has shown anti-Semitic sentiments. It isn't that there are no anti-Semitic sentiments in Iran, but it's far below everybody else within North Africa and the Middle East. So why is that? It's because the regime has done itself a great disservice by hating Israel so much, because then the people who are dissatisfied with the regime have decided that they're now going to be, not anti-Semitic, because
the friend of the enemy of the regime, in a way.
Yeah, exactly. But people are now, also paying attention to a lot of things about Israel and Israelis. Some of the television programming, Tehran and others, have done a wonderful job of really showing how much understanding and sympathy there is for Iran and Iranians. And then come these, political figures who totally, undermine all these wonderful efforts.
Well, to summarize, actress Niv Sultan and the series Tehran are probably doing us a better service right now than our ministers. You are a great advocate of pairing the pessimistic with the optimistic, the negative with the positive, and we will delve into that later in our conversation. But following that call of yours, what makes you hopeful at this moment, and what worries you?
What worries me is that the regime has been given yet another lifeline. A friend of mine who lives in Iran a long time ago gave me a metaphor that is quite funny, but also quite accurate. She said, every time the regime survives a big upheaval, it's like you're playing a video game and the character that you were pushing forward didn't get blown up. So then in the next phase of the video game, the same character is twice as large as it was the last time in the previous phase. And that's really, it's not very lyrical or poetic, but it's quite a good metaphor in that every time the regime survives, it becomes bigger. It believes its own narrative, that it's the representative of God on earth, that God wants the supreme leader to survive and defeat America and Israel and blah, blah. That's my concern. I think on the other hand, the good thing that has happened is that if there's sort of a silver lining, something to kind of be hopeful about, is that the regime and its cadre of leadership recognized how vulnerable they are and how they can lose everything in a matter of days. And so I think there are probably more pragmatic elements among them who, in the absence of the supreme leader at some point, are going to steer the country in a different direction. Because what's very surprising currently is that the current supreme leader happens to be far less pragmatic than the original supreme leader was. And I find that to be a great irony. I mean, Ayatollah Khomeini, who started all this, recognized in 1988 that he needed to end the war between Iran and Iraq because it had been going on for over 8 years. So he said, I'm going to drink the cup of poison and agree to this peace agreement with Iraq. He couldn't drink the cup of poison. I mean, Ayatollah Khomeini, the current supreme leader, could have also said, I'll drink the cup of poison and give up on the nuclear program. But he didn't. And I think this really must be frustrating to elements within his own circle who realize that their survival requires that they make some adjustments, give up certain things in order to stay in power.
Following on that, almost 50 years of Islamic rule in Iran means that entire generations have grown up with no memory of a liberal Iran. They've gone through a deeply ideological education system. So how do you see that shaping the chances for meaningful change? Even if this regime were to fall, what kind of Iran could emerge?
I think we could have been in a terrible place were it not for the accessibility of the internet and social media. So Iranians, especially the young generation, now know what it's like to live a normal life because they're on Instagram and they're on social media and they see how other kids their age live their lives. One of the very moving events of the protests in 2022 was the emergence of a hashtag called normal life. And I thought it was one of the most revolutionary but touching things I'd ever seen. Now, when we think about revolutions, we think about guns and we think about commandos and we think about guerrillas. But this revolutionary act, this hashtag, just said all we need to do, all we want, from this revolution in 2022 is to have a normal life. And then they listed, everybody kind of pitched in to say what it was that they were hoping for. So it was hashtag walk my dog, because dogs are banned in Iran. Dogs are, najis or dirty, unclean according to Islam or Shiite Islam. And so you can't have a pet dog in Iran. So one of the most revolutionary things that the kids were demanding back in 2022 was hashtag walk my dog, hashtag hold my lover's hand on the street, hashtag be able to dance, hashtag be able to sing. So, yes, they have been indoctrinated, but at the same time, they have gotten this window, this constant, 24/7 window to the ordinary lives of others, which they are yearning for. And I think that makes a huge difference. When you compare this to China, China has been able to completely establish its own internet that gives no real free access to its citizenship. Iran hasn't managed to do that. And that really makes a huge difference.
And I love watching videos of young Iranians in Tehran. They're so cool and gifted, the whole music scene, party scene, and underground culture. I think if there were two places I would love to visit in my lifetime, it's Tehran and Beirut. But when I'm thinking about the future of the country, I remind myself that just as, young New Yorkers aren't a reflection of America and central Tel Aviv isn't a reflection of all of Israel, I imagine that young Iranians seeking change aren't necessarily a reflection of the whole society. So, as much as one can know about a society under a repressive, non-democratic regime, what do we understand about the balance of power within Iranian society today? I mean, how would you describe the proportions between regime supporters and those who oppose it and want that change and normal life?
Well, the regime certainly has its followers, and 20, 30% of the entire population that benefits from it being in power, that partakes in all the economic goods that come through, their portioning of whatever freebies that they pass on. One of the things that's really important to remember, and I keep talking about this whenever I'm given a chance, is that the world is fortunate in that the Iranian regime isn't a brand new entity. In other words, in 1979, in 1980, in 1981, in 1982, even until maybe middle of the 80s, there was a sense of ideological fervor that really fueled the engine of the regime. And Ayatollah Khomeini was a true believer. And the people really thought that he could deliver on everything that he had promised. This is not 1982, 1983. We're in 2025. And one of the things that Iranians, more than the rest of us outside of Iran, have seen with their own eyes, possibly on a daily basis, is the degree to which the regime is corrupt. And it's so easily visible. There is a term that Iranians have created for the children of the ruling clergy and officials, and they call them Aghazadeh, meaning, the princes, the sort of the new class of princes. I mean, in a country that has been under so much economic sanction and has been suffering so much, by way of inflation and you name it, Iranians have felt, there are, in certain parts of Tehran, there are Ferraris and Maseratis and, cars that, I don't see on the streets of America or rarely see on the streets of America. So people have become fully aware that whatever there was, in the early stages of the revolution, it no longer is there. And that the only difference between this class of leadership in Iran and, Tony Soprano and his mafia is that, they don't speak English, they put on turbans and they, hide behind Islam as a cover. But it is an economic mafia. And it functions as an economic mafia. And you and I don't feel that because we don't live there. But those who do know. And therefore, they have lost their sense of commitment and trust. And after 2022 and, the killing of so many of the kids on the streets, the regime has also lost legitimacy in the eyes of the people. So do they have a following? Of course they have a following, because every regime stays in power because it makes sure that there is enough people supporting it so that they fight for it. But the majority in Iran would like the regime to go, except that they just, haven't figured out. And of course, Israel and America didn't help by attacking, but leaving the one element that could have brought about change still in place.
Do you think about a day when you'll be able to go back to visit your hometown, to walk the streets of your childhood again? I mean, is it still something that you're imagining?
I don't know. It's a good question because I have children now who have been born and raised in America, and they dream of going back. And that actually makes me angry. I feel like, enough already, let's move on. And so I think yes and no. I mean, on good days that I'm less angry, I think, oh, it would be wonderful. But these days I'm mostly angry, at which point I say, to hell with it all. What good is it, that I remain stuck. But I think there's a more serious answer to give to your question, which is that, and I think from a Jewish perspective, this is so easily understandable. I never left. Everything that is really profoundly meaningful about a culture, a place, depends on the mastery of its language, familiarity with its culture, and all the rest that kind of fall under that category. My mastery of all those things has remained intact and has even improved. So in some ways, which is why, I left when I was 18, and 40 plus years later, here I am, talking to you and talking to so many others. So I think, Paul Celan felt the same way when he wrote poetry in German, not just as well as every German, but even better. And I think this is in some ways, I think about it as a very Jewish exercise, in a way that we think, okay, you think you get rid of me, I will go somewhere else, but I will be so good at everything that, I inherited from this place, that you will come after me to say, will you please talk to me? Will you please, write for me? Will you please think about me? And in some ways, I have been fortunate enough to experience that.
I never left. That's a beautiful answer. And indeed, it is very Jewish. You were 12, right? During the revolution in Iran.
Yeah. Imagine, my poetry, the poetry that I've written in Persian in the United States, ends up coming out in anthologies inside Iran. I mean, what could be a greater victory? I mean, there are people who come from Iran and say, I brought you a book, and I flip through it and I see my poems.
Your poems, that's amazing. So you said you're angry. So in these days, you don't like, when days that you're angry to think about going back to Iran, but I'm taking you now back to Iran. Can you take us to that moment of the revolution as a young child? What did the revolution look like through the eyes of a young Jewish girl?
Well, I have a scene in my memoir. There's a chapter in my memoir called On the Rooftops. And there's a scene where my mom, my dad, and my brothers had already left Iran. This is late 1978. We're all on the rooftop. And there was still a few weeks before, the Pahlavi dynasty completely fell and was toppled. And Ayatollah Khomeini was still in Paris. And one of the very, really brilliant things, evil, brilliant things that he had come up with was to ask everybody in Iran to go up to the rooftops at the very same hour every night, which was 9 p.m., turn off the lights inside all of their homes. So there would be pitch dark everywhere you looked. And so this is winter, so it isn't like, summertime when the days are long and you still have, sunlight. It would be pitch black. So this was November, December of 1978. And you were to go to the rooftop in that darkness and shout Allahu Akbar, God is great, for 10 minutes, and that's it. I don't know if there is a top 10 list of the best acts of civil disobedience ever invented, but I'm sure this would make the list because it was so amazingly moving, because you couldn't see anybody. You were on top of the roof, but all you could hear was this murmur, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And I was on the rooftop. I think this is one chapter I'm really proud of in the book, because I remember, and I write about it in the memoir, that my mom and dad were terrified, because they weren't 12. They were adults who knew, what happens to Jews when revolutions, fundamentalist revolutions take place. So they were terrified. And my father was joking with my mother, and he was saying, Helen, you should say Allahu Akbar or the Goyim will be irritated. And my mother would say, stop, But they were, kind of going back and forth. And I was elated. I was mesmerized. I was electrified, because I'd never gone to a rock concert, so I didn't know what it was like to kind of lose yourself among a crowd and hear everybody kind of singing the same thing, doing the same thing. Maybe if I had had a rock concert experience or any concert experience, I wouldn't be so electrified. But I was 12 and I didn't have those experiences, and I thought it was just awe-inspiring. So I was excited, and I had already started reading, great literature. I was becoming familiar with, good poetry. And these were, works by Iranian poets and writers who all felt that the country could use more freedom. The country needed to, get to a better future. So I was reading these things, and it really stirred me. So I was all for it.
And looking back, do you think the revolution and the aftermath of it reshaped or influenced in any way your Jewish identity?
I was on a Jewish radio interview 20 years ago when my memoir first came out. And I was really happy because I thought, I've done really good. So this Jewish rabbi who has a radio broadcast wants to talk to me. I didn't know that he actually wanted to interview me so that he would make an example of me. Oh, silly Jewish girl.
Oh, yeah.
Thought that Iranian revolution could be good, and so she was rooting for it. Not mentioning that I was 12 and 13 and 14. I had no idea that he had really brought me on the show to sort of embarrass me and use me as a tool to make a lesson for his audience. And I said to him, but that's the most Jewish thing to do. Where in the world was there ever a revolution that the elites of Jews weren't involved in? I thought I was being the perfect Jew. And it's really interesting in retrospect. I gave a talk last week at an event for the American Sephardi Federation. I was receiving an award. I said, I always thought that I was the worst Jew in my family because everybody else is far more observant and religious. But, having been a writer for more than 20 years and having kind of dealt with these material that I deal with, I feel like I've been constantly doing everything that we're told to do day after day, week after week in Jewish prayer and scripture. Zecher litziat Mitzrayim. That's all I've been doing. I don't go to the synagogue, morning, noon, and night, but I think that this is how I understand my practice. I think I am keeping my commitment to an important memory.
You've talked in the past about having a complicated relationship with your Jewish identity, particularly around gender roles in the Iranian Jewish community. Can you tell me a bit more about that struggle and whether you feel you've reached a point of comfort or reconciliation with that part of yourself?
Well, there wasn't actually much of a struggle. I turned 18 and 19. I came to America and I realized that if I want to be who I wanted to be, I couldn't stay within the Iranian Jewish community, meaning that I couldn't live within that community and run my life the way I wanted to. I don't know if leaving is the right word, but I separated myself. So, there are a lot of people at my book readings and elsewhere who get excited and say, there are a lot of Jews, Iranian Jews in Los Angeles. And I say, well, that's why I'm in Connecticut. So, I think what has happened after 3 decades or so is that it isn't that I became comfortable with them. I think they became comfortable with me. And the more they lived in America, the more they understood what their rights were as women, the more I became appealing. So I don't think I changed, but I think they have warmed up to me. Last week, I was receiving this award at American Sephardi Federation, and I saw that there were a whole bunch of people who came up to me and said, Iranian Jews, that, they love me and they love my work. And I said, I wonder what you would say, 35 years ago. But
times they are changing. As said, you speak critically about the term Persian Jews. Why don't you like it?
It's not that only the Jews call themselves Persian Jews. There are Iranians who are, not Jewish, who are Muslims or other things who, call themselves Persians. I think fundamentally when you do that, you are trying to disown Iran, because Iran is a problematic place right now and has been for almost half a century. I don't know, we don't disown the bad. I mean, in the same way that I object to the idea of, removing the statues of, Confederate generals from American squares. I've always been among the people who have said, don't remove them, add to them, put a plaque up that explains, the guy who did this also did X, Y, and Z. I just think that disowning your past or anything about your present is the wrong way to go about historically embarrassing situations or historically wrong situations. So I think we should all introduce ourselves or, say that we are Iranians and let people say, oh, we thought Iranians are all, mullahs. So that I get an opportunity to say, Iran has had a very robust, eclectic, and multicultural past. But when we call ourselves Persians, and people have oftentimes said, you mean Persian or Parisian? It's sort of this desire to kind of get yourself mixed up with nicer people, put yourself somewhere else. I just think that we own it all. We broke it. It looks bad, whatever it is. We own it all, and we should live up to it.
There's a story that you've shared about a swastika that was drawn in your son's private school bathroom, and how limited was the way the school handled it compared to what you thought should have been done. Could you talk a bit about that moment and what it revealed to you about American Jewish life? And this takes us back to your belief that we need to pair the negative with the positive and optimistic with the pessimistic.
Right. It's so interesting. This is a story from 6 or 7 years ago. My kids were in non-Jewish day school, very private school in New England, and so it's the last place on earth anybody would think that there would be a swastika. And then there was a swastika on the bathroom wall. And it's amazing because Dara Horn had yet to publish her brilliant People Love Dead Jews. So I was very curious to see how the school would deal with this, especially because the principal at the time was an Israeli-American. So I thought, wow, what a wonderful opportunity.
He'll know what to do.
Yeah, she knows what to do, everybody else, and people are in for a great lesson on Jews and so on. So what happened was they immediately removed the swastika, and then they called the ADL, and the ADL brought out Holocaust survivor to talk to the kids. And I think I was writing something on the subject, and so I went and I asked the kids, how was it? How was the talk? And some of the kids said, it was amazing. And I said, how was it amazing? That somebody so old could walk and talk. And I said, so what else? And they said, no, really, she was so old, and they tried to describe it, and she was still walking and talking. And then, it dawned on me that in this school there was African American Pride Week and Hispanic American Pride Week and Asian American Pride Week and this and that, and there was so much joy and celebration associated with all those things. But when there was a Jewish issue, we would go and resort to this giant tragedy that that happened so long ago that these kids, 12, 13, and 14, could not in any way, shape, or form find accessible. So it really infuriated me that we needed to resort to the tale of our victimhood in order to justify why it was that we should not be violated or discriminated against. I had gone to that school, watched those kids, watched those teachers talk with pride about, African American basketball players and, civil society leaders and singers and writers and, of all sorts. But the only education on the Jewish front that the kids were receiving was not on these things that they could, look at and be proud of or feel, those figures could inspire them or they wanted to aspire to them. It was about the Holocaust. So I really thought that there's something profoundly wrong.
And I think it's very timely, though you say, it happened a few years ago, but it's very timely to the times that we're living now, not defining ourselves only by trauma, only by victimhood. Actually, a lot of the guests on this podcast talk about it, on finding the definition for our Jewish identity, which is positive, which brings joy with it, and not only the suffering and the hard memories. Do you relate to that?
Absolutely. Oh, completely. Maybe it's because in some ways, I feel very strongly about my Jewish identity, but it is an identity that I shaped for myself on my own, because I realized that the Jewish identity that I had inherited from my family was in some ways burdensome. And there had to be something else that allowed me to be who I was while I was also Jewish. So I think it is that break that I underwent that allowed me to kind of discover a different possibility of being Jewish. And in that different possibility, I see all joy. I see, what's not to love? It's so much fun. It's Purim and it's singing and it's, and then, you may have seen this. I talk about this all the time. I mean, the idea that I go to a place every Saturday morning, or as many Saturday mornings as I can, where everybody loves the book so much that they get up whenever the book shows up. And then they want to kiss the book and they want to hug the book and they want to walk with the book. And I'm a writer, so what is it? What's not to love about all this? What do they teach my kids when they were 6, 7, 8, and 9? Anne Frank. They had to read Anne Frank. I just think that this is the biggest missed opportunity that we ever had. And whenever I've talked about it with other American Jews, that, why don't you guys talk about your great contributions, your great figures? They say, but, we wanted to be humble. What does that mean? We just thought that we don't want to rub the faces of everybody else with our own accomplishments.
All of the Nobel Prizes and etc.
Or just, fun. I mean, everybody else is celebrating their contributions. Why are we somewhat invisible or left out of that kind of piece of history?
Roya, as an Iranian Jew who found a home in America, what is your relationship with Israel? What does Israel mean to you personally, emotionally, politically?
Well, it means more and more as the years have passed, and as I see Israel entangled in the very problem that drove us out of Iran, right? So that's sort of the political element. I sympathize with Israel because I feel like Israel and I have the same problem. So politically I understand that. But personal level, I look at Israel as the greatest liberation story of the 20th century. You have to remember that I'm part of a community of people, Iranian diaspora, who have been trying to figure out for 40 plus years how to write a different destiny for themselves and their people. And they haven't been able to figure it out. And I look at our people and I think, wow, we figured it out. A group of selfless people who probably, weren't as selfless as they seem now, from the perspective of 80 years or 80 plus years, but, decided that the most important thing that they could do was to come together and try to do something to change the future. You know how many times I've sat in groups of Iranian diaspora and they have been in discussion trying to say, so what do we do? How do we create a coalition? And I've seen them fail time and time again. And every time their failure just gives me another feeling of, my God, how did those discriminated against Jews who had suffered so much in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, everywhere, managed to do what this community cannot do? I don't know. In every possible way, in both politically, personally, it's a source of great inspiration for me.
Last angle in our conversation, you came to the US from Iran as a young adult. Not a lot of English, not a lot of money, no connections, and yet you became a widely respected writer and public thinker, poet. How does that background shape how you view today's immigration debate in the US, especially the polarized political discourse and recent actions by the administration?
I think it's one of the saddest things that is happening to America. Of course, it's not unusual. America has gone through these periods of, collective xenophobic reaction to foreigners. But I think it's the very beauty of this country that is at the heart of this multi-layered, multifaceted nation. Now, that's not to say that American immigration system doesn't need reforming, and there wasn't a problem at the border. All those problems existed, but the idea that we need to stop allowing people to come, or the notion which says, Donald Trump gave a talk, I think in 2015, before he became president the first time around, and that actually became the incentive that got me to write my third book, which is sort of the story of an immigrant in America. And he said, our country is full. Our country is full. And, here I am in the suburbs of Connecticut looking around, I can't even see the next house. And there's only deer and wild turkeys in my backyard. And I'm saying, are you sure? Where I am, our country really could use some more people. So I think it's a betrayal of those that miraculous founding formula that made America what America is. And I think it's trying to mess with the formula that will, in my view, surely mess with the composition and the nature of this nation.
We've reached the final part of our conversation, the Jewish Crossroads questionnaire. 5 quick and fun questions. Are you ready?
I think so.
What's your earliest Jewish memory?
My father held my hand, and every Shabbat evening, and we walked to synagogue. It's one of the best memories of my childhood. Oh, and then there's a second. People who had a dead person or the anniversary of somebody who had died in Iran used to make quiche and bring it to the synagogue. And they used to cut it up in small pieces and hold it up at the entrance of the shul. And so you would say a bracha in the memory of the person who had died and take a piece. And so I used to go back and forth, say many, many brachot, so that I could take more.
Have a piece. If you could meet any Jewish figure from history, ancient or modern, who would it be and why?
Well, I don't know, Isaac Bashevis Singer. I know he was a very cantankerous and, oftentimes unlikable person, but I have spent a lot of time reading him, so.
What is your favorite or most meaningful Jewish tradition?
Passover.
Why?
There's a book to read,
A writer, a poet, a writer.
I think it's the idea. I mean, I do that to everybody, even for like fun dinners, but to think that I don't have to force it on people, that it's part of the evening, that I hand books to everybody and we all have to sit and read. It's just, I'm in heaven.
If you could jump 100 years into the future, what would you hope to see for the Jewish people?
I want to see an Israel that does not have to feel threatened by its neighbors.
What's one Jewish word? It could be in Hebrew, English, usually I say Yiddish, but Persian or otherwise, that feels particularly meaningful to you right now.
L'chaim. And the idea that we celebrate life has become so much more meaningful to me, having experienced a culture that celebrates death. So I think that the idea that we cherish life and the living is so fundamentally important.
L'chaim. Roya Hakakian, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. Toda.
Toda. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Jewish Crossroads. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to write to us at jewishcrossroadspod@gmail.com. Thank you to Tomer Atzabi Bar, who edited this chapter. We'll see you next time, same place, same journey, with a new voice. See you soon.